Sonic the Hedgehog for the Sega Genesis was released in 1991, and it's been about, 27 years since that date. My personal history with the Hog of Hedges didn't begin until 2003 when Sonic Adventure DX came out for the GameCube, and even then, I barely cared about Sonic because I was all about the Chow Garden back then. It wasn't until I was older when I finally got around to trying out the first Snock. This was the game that spawned the blue anomaly we all still talk about endlessly today. But more importantly, it established the traditional classic Sonic gameplay style that would be used in the Blue Hedgehog's following lineup of games for a couple years until the 00255 rodent added 1D and never looked back. Until sometime later when classic Sonic's usage would resurge. Now, what do I mean by classic Sonic, you might ask? Well, generally speaking, the internet and more importantly Sega themselves likes to classify Sonic's main styles of play into 3 or 4 parts. The classics, the adventure titles, even Super Sonic Galaxy, original joke, and the boost formula, of course. Think of classic Sonic as the 2D side-scrolling platforming version. The one most people are probably familiar with seeing, as the games this style is featured in are the best-selling Sonic installments to date. It's a style that's also had some time and polish to really blossom into a solid type of gameplay. Starting with Sonic 1, you could only take control of Sonic, and the plot and characters were all pretty limited. Focus was on the gameplay, and for its first entry, I'd say Sonic Team had a clear idea with what they were doing. Unlike its contemporary competitors, Sonic had a slippery, faster control to him. Speed was the marketing point here, and yeah, speed is definitely one of the main components to the gameplay. Levels are designed to be longer and taller to compensate for this speed, and there are loop-de-loops, hills, and other ways to really show the player that you're going through the level with speed and style. Enemies are planted in a manner so they can be used to this speed advantage as well, furthering this whole speed-based endeavor. With Sonic 1 being the first game of its name, it obviously is going to have some kinks in the system, where the following installments would try to patch up. Enemy placement would sometimes be absolutely stupid, where you could be going through a level at a fast pace and an enemy would come out of nowhere to halt your progress and make you lose all your rings in the process. This had some to do with the limitations of the hardware of the system the classic titles were released on, I think. Being in an aspect ratio of 4:3 with no other way to improve, it limited what could be displayed at a time, leading to these frustrating moments where you could be killed by shit you couldn't even react to. But of course, the fact that Sonic's sprite is a lot larger than other platforming mascot sprites of the time only exacerbates this issue. Plus, the camera keeps Sonic in the dead center of the screen at all times, which, coupled with the aspect ratio and the larger sprite, it makes it harder to maneuver levels. Other games like Donkey Kong Country, which also had larger sprites, had the good sense to shift the camera over in the direction you were running, which was a good fix to the issue. I'll give Sonic Team some slack though, because DKC was released 3 years after the first Sonic game, so it did have the time to reflect on the strengths and weaknesses of prior past platformers. Getting back to Sonic 1, however, this isn't bad design that makes the game unplayable by any means, but I think it was just an oversight due to primitive tech back then. Regardless, I think a lot of Sonic 1's flaws in the gameplay are due to that first game syndrome. I say this because the following Sonic games tried their hand at improving these issues, culminating with what I think is the best classic Sonic game of that era. See, this sequel is why I think Sonic's early years are perfect examples of sequeling done right. The developers identified problems with their previously established formula, fixed them, and innovated the gameplay with a variety of entertaining new gameplay elements. Now, you could charge a spin dash as Sonic to further increase your speed, which complemented the speedy nature of these levels' design. You can use the spin dash to interact with the environment as well, with it being used to rotate wheels to open rock doors, roofs, or floors in Marble Garden Zone, to use elevators in Lava Reef Zone, to push rocks easily in Sandopolis Zone, and so much more. Spin dashing was a game changer. The mechanic incentivized you to go fast with how fun it was to do, and encouraged strategic plays. You could use the spin dash to cross gaps or get to out of reach areas if you were skilled enough. Another brilliant addition to the series were these power shields, power-ups that let you do a whole host of different things. Sonic has an insta-shield where a shield can appear in mid-air to thwart hazards, but there are also flame shields, water shields, and lightning shields that can be used to give Snock a dash in mid-air, bounce, or have a double jump respectively. These shields serve the same purpose of power-ups in any other platformer. They spice up the gameplay and give you some different style of play when you get them. Since you lose these shields when you take a hit, this makes you play more carefully because having a shield is extremely useful and not to mention fucking fun. Snock Threekles also introduced having two other playable characters, being Tails and Knuckles. These characters played similarly to how Sonic played, but they also had different abilities and strengths. Tails could ascend vertically for a certain amount of time, while Knuckles could hover and climb up walls. Each character was equally as quick, and gameplay was centered around the traditional side-scrolling, fast-paced platforming Sonic was known for. There were no variations to how the core gameplay was. Knuckles didn't have to dig for Master Emerald pieces in a 2D exploration stage, and Tails wasn't suddenly in a Transformers cosplay. Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles all essentially played the same. Each just had a little unique quirk of their own gameplay-wise. This is how you do different playable characters right in a game that establishes itself as a platforming-centric title right off the bat. It keeps the focus on fast-paced platforming while giving the players some different aspects to mess around with. Tails and Knuckles exist to keep Sonic 3 and Knuckles feeling fresh and fun. They don't exist to artificially pad out the length of the game with content that isn't the traditional way of speed-centric gameplay. Note that I didn't say the other way around is necessarily wrong. I mean, I actually like the treasure hunting stages in Sonic Adventure 1. Anyways, my point is that Sonic 3 and Knuckles has a bunch of new elements that add some different flavors to the mix, along with some excellently crafted levels that are really enjoyable. With every stage of Snock Threekles, you sort of have to learn the best way to get through them considering Sonic's acceleration and speedy nature. I found myself dying quite a bit on earlier playthroughs, and honestly, I can see why some people might find this style of gameplay annoying. You'll find yourself stopping or sometimes going through very carefully to avoid obstacles and hazards. This is admittedly very frustrating, and it rings true for the earlier Sonic games when the developers were just figuring out what to do for the Hedgehog. Two ideologies, one with going fast and one with taking your time, are in conflict when you platform. This makes the movement scheme seem inconsistent with the level design. Obviously, other 2D platformers do this better, where movement and level design are in harmony, making for an ideal experience. But with classic Sonic, I don't see this as necessarily a bad design choice. Ultimately, it comes down to personal taste, but I like that the game encourages you to take your time and think about platforming while also being something you can blast through when you know how the level operates. I don't mind this clunkiness because I still find the games to be fun despite the flaws. With being able to play as Tails and Knuckles, this grants you somewhat of a handicap where you can correct your mistakes with platforming by using their powers of flight and gliding. That being said, classic Sonic has its fair share of utter bullshit, showing some signs of dated design philosophies, but I think the concepts all work pretty well for what's being attempted. I can see why this style of play is beloved by many and why Sonic Team chose to continue its legacy later down the road. Many people adore the classics out of nostalgia and for what people see as ideal Sonic titles. This, coupled with classic Sonic's past and high sales, is why I think we've seen so much classic Sonic lately. Sega knows all too well that people love the style of the past, so if it works so well and people like it, why not try to improve on the style and bring it up to the modern age? This was attempted with Generations, and I think Sonic Team succeeded for the most part. Sonic has a nice acceleration, and with the spin dash you can pull off some spectacular movement. Platforming still requires a bit of time to get used to, however, and you still have to think about your movement improvement. This isn't some gameplay style where you can just haphazardly go through the levels at top speed and still expect to win and get an S rank. Trial and error is required, and since there's a hub world, continues, and generous lives, Classic Sonic rarely gets annoying. The only problem I had with this mode is that I just wanted there to be more of it since I was having so much fun. I wanted the shields from Son 3 in the levels to use, and not just as some item you can buy from the shop. I wanted there to be more playable characters with slightly different fun attributes like the previous Classic Sonic game. I wanted a more ambitious game that took risks and didn't just rely on nostalgia. And well, I guess I got what I wanted. Sonic Mania is precisely what any fan of classic Sonic was hoping for. With beautiful sprite work and environments and an assortment of musical bangers, this game is a celebration of Sonic's past while also trying to implement new fresh ideas. This is a game for fans by fans, and from the way it plays in demos, I can say that the team has evolved the style of classic Sonic in an interesting, unique way. Shields return, playable buddies return, and so do other iconic set pieces from past games. But there are new gameplay elements like the ones featured in Studiopolis, a fascinating take on special stages, and Sonic even has a drop dash now. Everything about Sonic Mania screams charm and creativity, but more importantly, it serves as a display of how far classic Sonic has come. From 4x3 to 16x9 more specifically, so that the problem I mentioned before with deathly hazards coming out of nowhere is vastly minimized. Plus, the focus of Sonic Mania is on one gameplay style, which I personally like. Not only that, but this one gameplay style seems to be given the time to be fully fleshed out and entertaining. See, originally Classic Sonic's concept was solid, but the execution was a little shaky given the hardware limitations of the Sega Genesis and the fact that Sonic Team had only just been created. But the concept has evolved over time into a solid style of Sonic gameplay. One I think warrants at least one playthrough to see if it's your cup of tea. And what a better time to indulge in some of that drug-infused beverage than now with Sonic Mania. Now, of course, there is the other side of this legacy, and it's on the more cynical side, I guess. While you indulge in some good old-fashioned fun, why don't I indulge in some good old-fashioned negativity for a second? An argument does exist that classic Sonic is a bit overused, to the point of annoyance. The more pessimistic side of me would say that Sega is nostalgia pandering when they implement classic Sonic into so many of their modern games, since they know that he's such a nostalgic icon that many hold near and dear. This is an understandable complaint in terms of the direction Sonic seems to be going. I think relying on nostalgia can be a bad thing because eventually that charm will fade away when it's used too much. With Sonic Mania, I wouldn't agree because the game is meant to be a celebration of the past and seems like a game really inspired by the classic era of Sonic installments. Its aesthetics, and more importantly how it plays, emphasizes this idea that Mania is essentially a classic Sonic title just many years later. Sonic Forces lies on the opposite side of the spectrum because the game uses classic Sonic in a way almost too similar to Generations. The problem with Forces classic Sonic is that it also has to compete with Mania's classic Sonic and Generations classic Sonic. It competes with Mania in the sense that the two games are coming out very close to one another, instigating obvious comparisons between the two. And it competes with Generations in the sense that just 6 years ago, classic Sonic was used in that game in an almost identical way. This paradoxical relationship where classic Sonic is awesomely exciting in one and seemingly fatigued in the other is just what's to be expected. Classic Sonic and Forces will be fun, I have no doubt about that, but I can see why people would criticize classic Sonic for being overdone. Do I think classic Sonic has worn out its welcome? Nah, I really don't, but I think Forces could benefit from its classic Sonic gameplay style somehow being more distinct from its predecessors. That's really the only problem with classic Sonic as it ages. The pressure for innovation is higher. Mania is a step in the right direction with keeping things fresh, and perhaps with something like Sonic Mania 2, we'll see classic Sonic return with even more nuance. It's surprisingly cool to see classic Sonic continue 27 years after its inception. People seem to dig how Sega is going about Sonic Mania, and with Forces, it probably won't be terrible. The gameplay gameplay style derived from the Genesis titles has come a long way since then. Sonic 3 and Knuckles will always be my favorite of the bunch, purely due to how distinct it is from the others and how much the gameplay has improved since the first installment. I think Classic Sonic is a good example of how to continue a series in a proper and respectful manner. It's a series that's only improved as it's went along, and for that, it deserves a medal. Or maybe a certificate, I'm not that rich. I will always love Chao Adventure the most, purely due to my nostalgic attachment to the adventure games, but I can't deny that the concept of Classic Sonic is interesting and pretty good. I'll be interested to see what Sonic Team can do next for this style of play, and how they can keep it interesting if Classic Sonic isn't inevitably put down. As always, thank you so much for watching, and take care. Have a wonderful day.